This is Economics in Russian with your host Mikhail Khazin. And today we're going to discuss a fairly recent piece of news. The United States of America has passed new crypto laws. Uh, there are a ton of opinions about this. Some say it's an absolute miracle, hooray, happiness all around, while others, well, think it's something else entirely. Uh, so, we need to figure this out. All right, before we start digging in, let me take you back to the fairly distant past. 30 years ago, in the summer of 1995, I was appointed head of the Credit Policy Department at the Ministry of Economy of the Russian Federation, and at the same time, Executive Secretary of the Government Commission for Combating Unaccounted Cash Circulation. Why was there a need for such a commission? The thing is, in Russia during the 90s, the ruble made up only a small part of the overall turnover. In 1995, the money supply was, let me be precise, 80, 40, 24% of GDP, which is about 4 times less than the normal level. As a result, there was an absolutely enormous amount of monetary surrogates in circulation, which took the form of all sorts of different instruments. These included cash dollars, non-cash dollars, all kinds of treasury tax exemptions, and other monetary instruments that were formally issued by the state. In reality, they were freely circulating. And also promissory notes from natural monopolies, Gazprom, RAOUES, the Ministry of Railways, and even, believe it or not, MMM tickets. And this whole setup created a very unpleasant situation because it became absolutely impossible to collect taxes. Everything bypassed the accounting books, everything bypassed the cash register, and somehow this issue needed to be resolved. By the way, back then, one of the favorite ways to avoid taxation was this remarkable method of paying salaries. Of course, it was only suitable for large companies, but they say that by the end, even small ones had learned how to do it. At that time, interest on deposits was not taxed. And the situation was as follows. Corporations would open accounts for their employees in their own banks or in friendly banks. Deposits were placed into these accounts, and monthly interest was paid out from them, which essentially served as the employees' salaries. As a result, the actual salary was not taxed at all. And, accordingly, since the deposits were kept in friendly banks, new loans were immediately issued against them, so the issue was resolved automatically. And basically, my task was to figure out what to do about this, whether anything could be done, and, accordingly, to actually do something. At this point, I should explain what an executive secretary is. So, the commission included all sorts of people, a large number of various bosses, the Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs, the Deputy Head of the Tax Police, the Deputy Head of the Tax Service, some head of something in the FSB. I don't even remember exactly who anymore. Basically, people at the level of Lieutenant General. And they would share their thoughts at meetings with Ignatiev, who at the time was the Deputy Minister of the Economy and the chairman of this commission. They would express various opinions, their own ideas, and so on. And my job was to take these stories and ideas, as well as my own understanding of how things were set up, and prepare the documents. The result of this work was that in the summer of 1996, before the elections, a number of documents were adopted, mostly presidential decrees. In particular, it was then that we solved one fundamentally important problem. The thing was, individuals could withdraw cash from their accounts, but legal entities couldn't do this without essential documents. At least, not in large amounts. At that time, this problem was solved very simply. There were individual entrepreneurs, and their accounts were absolutely identical to those of private individuals. So for this reason, every legal entity had a certain group of entrepreneurs whom they supposedly paid for something, and those entrepreneurs would withdraw money from their accounts without any restrictions whatsoever. In fact, one of our achievements was that we separated the ACC accounts and, accordingly, for individual entrepreneurs, we equated ACC accounts in status to those of legal entities. Of course, many people made a fuss, but I'll say it again. At that time, I was the head of the credit policy department at the Ministry of Economy. Another thing we did was, by the way, thanks to this very decision, it became impossible to pay salaries without taxes. This caused a huge uproar. There was a massive scandal in the summer of 1996, and it was a unique case. So, before the presidential elections, a decree was signed. If I remember correctly, it was number 1215. 2 weeks later, the presidential elections took place. Chubaya was appointed as the head of the administration. The oligarchs came to Chubaya about 3 or 4 weeks later. The decree was repealed, supposedly at Chubaya's initiative. This is the only case when a presidential decree was repealed just like that, and it's a typical example of, so to speak, the oligarchs interfering in the affairs of the state. So, my clash with the oligarchs actually began back in the summer of '96. By the way, it just so happened that all the participants in this work hid themselves, and the only figure, so to speak, who was identified was me, which led to some rather spiteful articles in the press. From these, I learned with interest that some journalists, who at that time were considered, so to speak, symbols of honesty and perestroika since the late '80s, in fact, turned out to be completely corrupt. Hired hacks. It's not that I was terribly upset, but in general, it was kind of a bit of a revelation for me. So now, the reason I'm telling you all this is as follows. The thing is, thanks to both my official position as head of the Credit Policy Department and my work as Executive Secretary of the Government Commission, I gained a certain, kind of experience. Yes, I read American materials. I read materials from the European Union and a lot of other things as well. And, accordingly, I can say that the conclusion I drew from all this was the following. Any monetary surrogates worsen the economic situation in the country and reduce tax collection. In other words, if you allow something other than money, national money, yes, in our case rubles, then in that case, the economy and the state will definitely incur losses, of course, to someone else's benefit. So usually, when someone is lobbying for this, it's for a specific interest. Let me draw your attention to this. If, for some reason, the money supply in a country is below the normal level, which is about 90 to 110% of GDP, sometimes 80 to 120 if it's a specific type of economy, then in reality, this only means one thing, that part of the monetary circulation is happening not in the national currency. Taxes are not being fully paid, and the profits are going to the wrong people. If we look at Russia, we'll see that our money supply is very low. Why is that? Because we lack an investment component. Private investment in Russia is not profitable. What does that mean? It means that instead of producing goods domestically, we buy imports. In other words, the profits that could have been working within the country, creating jobs, paying taxes, and the scale of tax collection would have increased by about 2 times if we had a normal money supply and proper domestic investment. Let me repeat, not by 3%, by 2 times. But this contradicts. Let me tell you what this contradicts. For now, let me just say a general phrase about liberal dogmas. And for this reason, it's the importers who end up getting these profits. And for the most part, they keep these profits outside of Russia. That's our problem. I'm not going to get into political constructs right now. But because of our flawed monetary policy, the state is missing out on about half the taxes it could be collecting. Let me repeat, I have a lot of experience with this issue. In this sense, the monetary system back in the 90s, now 100 years ago, even 200 years ago, hasn't really changed all that much. What has changed is the tools a bit. Now we have things like electronic transactions and so on. We also have much better statistics now. So today, we understand how the monetary system works much better than back then, but the essence has hardly changed. And economic transactions are facilitated by money. And either these transactions are transparent and controllable. What does controllable mean? It means you can collect taxes from them. Or, alternatively, they happen in secret, using monetary surrogates for that purpose. And that's when problems start. Let me give you an example. After the crisis at the beginning of 2008, an acquaintance of mine, a truly remarkable person, or as it's fashionable to say now, someone with creative thinking, but to put it simply, a dreamer, Rustam Davletbayev, was talking with his friend, who was the director, I can't quite remember, I think it was a collective farm. But the legal form had already changed. It was now an LLC, called Shemurtovo in Bashkiria. After the 2008 crisis, there was no money. He couldn't pay salaries because salaries have to be paid every month, but the harvest only comes in once a year. And loans weren't being issued. This created major problems, and Rustam Davletbayev introduced a new model. He introduced, well, in the literature, this is called Gessel money, but the word money is misleading. I'll talk more about this later. So, he introduced Gessel money, which are basically vouchers with a depreciating value. In other words, today this piece of paper is worth 100 rubles, tomorrow it's 98 rubles, the day after tomorrow 96 rubles, and so on. This really speeds up circulation. And why isn't this considered money? Because it doesn't have a savings function, you can't accumulate it. It loses its value after a certain period of time. But since there were no regular rubles, in Shemurtovo they started using these so-called shemratiks for things like paying wages. Since the main store belonged to the owner of the LLC, he allowed himself to buy goods with his own money and, accordingly, sell them in the store for these shemratiks. Then some very interesting effects began to appear. For example, taxi drivers started accepting shemratiks. And not just any taxi drivers, but those from Ufa. Why? Because if they were going to Shemirtovo, they would accept payment in Shemirtiks, stop by the village store, buy food there, come back to Ufa, and it turned out to be cheaper than buying the same food for rubles in Ufa. And then the workers and everyone else started doing the same thing. In other words, the hired workers who weren't members of that collective farm. As a result, the system started to work. The agricultural enterprise began to grow rapidly. But at the same time, a very interesting effect was discovered, which Rustam Davletbey described when he talked about this. As soon as rubles appeared, the Shamratiks disappeared, because they couldn't compete with real rubles. They only work in conditions where rubles are absent. And then there was a funny story, because the central bank filed a lawsuit against Shemiratovo, supposedly for issuing monetary surrogates. It won in several courts, but lost in the Supreme Court of Bashkiria, because it was stated there, I was actually an expert at that trial, that since there is no savings function, Shamratiks cannot be considered money. But basically, the court prohibited them from paying salaries with them. That is, you could give out Shamratiks as vouchers in addition to salaries. But as the monetary situation normalized, this topic naturally faded away. Shamratiks were no longer needed. So, today in our country, it actually wouldn't be a bad idea to introduce Shamratiks in the investment sphere. Unfortunately, that's impossible because you can't buy building materials or anything else with monetary surrogates. And the state keeps a very close watch on this precisely because it wants to collect taxes, not realizing that as a result, it actually ends up collecting less in taxes. Well, look, just imagine for a second that, by the way, this is a mechanism I actually proposed back in the mid-90s when we had the non-payment crisis. Imagine that the state, using printed money, creates a structure that it finances at a very low interest rate. The money is free for the state there. It printed it, and for that reason, any interest at all is pure profit. The state, puts this money into the charter capital of special development institutions, which then, on a project basis, that is, with an already approved budget, begin to build production. So, roughly speaking, today we buy nails from China, but here a small factory is being built that produces these nails domestically. This means these nails are produced and sold taking into account that the interest rate is extremely low, if it even exists at all. And, well, and in general, since this is a project-based approach, the cost of money is basically nothing. So it turns out that the only thing needed is working capital loans. That's where interest payments actually come into play. So you get a new factory where several dozen people are employed. These people receive salaries and, accordingly, pay taxes. When this factory is built, equipment is purchased. In other words, new orders appear and new financial flows emerge that didn't exist before. Then metal is bought, then electricity is purchased, then rent is paid, and so on and so forth. And back then, in the 90s, we calculated that if such a scheme were implemented, let me remind you, the money supply was much lower then than it is even now. We wouldn't have inflation, we'd have deflation, because the turnover of the ruble would increase more than the amount of money originally printed. It would be necessary, we would have to print more money to ensure normal circulation. By the way, a similar situation occurred at the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023 when Mishustin sharply increased the volume of government investments. Government investments are pretty much the same as emission money. In other words, they're free. And as a result, first, economic growth began after 10 years of stagnation. But most importantly, at the same time, inflation started to fall exactly through the mechanism we discovered in the mid-90s. Because the sphere of ruble circulation grew more than the amount of money that was printed. So, additional money was needed to cover this sphere of circulation. But, as we know, some people didn't like that, and the result is obvious. And now, in other words, this wasn't a unique situation of the 90s, but rather a universal law. If the money supply in the national currency is below the norm, then issuing the national currency and injecting it properly into the economy reduces inflation and, accordingly, increases economic growth. So now I explained all of this so that we understand that the laws of money are, in general, quite universal. And now we're coming back to Trump's crypto laws. What are they about? Here's the essence. So, the key point is, there are three laws, but I won't name them or go into their details because you can find all that online. I'll be explaining what this is actually being done for and what effect it will have. So, the main goal of these laws, well, there are two main goals. First, to reduce the administrative burden on cryptocurrency transactions because the government had been clamping down so hard that using cryptocurrencies became extremely difficult. Basically, it turned into a kind of security that was insanely overregulated. Any movement, almost always, meant a criminal case. The Investigative Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and so on and so forth. And accordingly, the second, and this is the main thing, it's the possibility of circulating guaranteed crypto assets, basically stable coins. So how does that work? So, what is Bitcoin? It's a kind of system with open source code that allows people to exchange certain assets. And by definition, the number of these assets is limited. Now, I'm not going to talk about mining and other things right now. That's all kind of beside the point. In reality, the number does grow a little, and you can get some for yourself in a certain way called mining. But the main thing is something else. It's impossible to just print more of them, regardless of who participates in the process. But there are absolutely no guarantees that this thing will be worth anything. In other words, Bitcoin is purely a speculative element. People buy it solely in order to sell it later. This is the result, you could say, of the existence of so-called market thinking. But theoretically, you could create the same kind of scheme only based, for example, on the dollar. In other words, or on U.S. Treasury bonds. So, in other words, there is a company that has certain assets, either dollars, or treasury bonds, or maybe even gold. It doesn't really matter. And it decides, in order to make it significantly easier to manage its valuable assets, I will issue these very specific coins, that is, digital records that absolutely cannot be forged. which are intrinsically tied to these treasury bonds. Break time equals 0.5s forward slash. And instead of buying bonds, which involve all sorts of bureaucratic procedures for buying and selling, you buy these assets, which sit in your wallet on your computer, and you can use these assets to pay for things as if they were treasury bonds or dollars. This really simplifies transactions, and it allows, yes, I want to point out, there is still control, everything is fine. The only thing that needed to be removed were the bureaucratic and administrative restrictions, which is exactly what Trump's laws were aimed at. But from an economic standpoint, these are monetary surrogates. In other words, instead of using dollars, well, what happens when the government issues its own treasury bonds and sells them? It receives dollars, which go into the budget, and accordingly, those dollars can be used for payments. But you can't pay taxes with these very same stablecoins. So, the idea is that if you need to pay taxes but don't have money in your accounts, you sell some of your stablecoins on the market, get dollars, and then pay your taxes. This is a typical, classic monetary surrogate. The question is, what effect will this have? The effect will be as follows. There will be a decrease in the inflow of money into the budget, and this will have a negative impact on the economy. But here I don't have, well, not a shadow of a doubt, precisely because I observed all this in real life. In the 90s, yes, of course, the scale of this phenomenon was beyond our control. Well, that is, we had, I repeat, the money supply was 5 times. How much was it there? In 1996, it was 12% of GDP. In other words, it was 8 times less than the norm. And the remaining, accordingly, 7/8 were made up of monetary surrogates, though part of those were in dollars. There was also a very interesting thing. Part of the turnover happened outside the country. That is, large companies were sold as packages of shares, like of subsidiary structures traded in the West. Accordingly, no one paid any taxes. And, well, special prices were used, too. In other words, a Russian company would set up, well, like, create a subsidiary somewhere in the West and sell raw materials extracted here to that subsidiary at below market prices, explaining, guys, what's the problem? It's the same company, it's just internal transactions. That's it. So, that's how it was. Well, in fact, this was capital outflow without paying any taxes. This is a typical scheme. The introduction of monetary surrogates inevitably leads to an economic downturn. Well, if there was significant economic growth, then it results in slower growth rates and reduced budget revenues. I was deeply convinced that when the PayPal team, that is, Thiel, Musk, and Sachs, went to the Trump administration, they promised that they would solve this problem and create a full-fledged alternative to the dollar. But then they ran into the very problem I was talking about, the same one we faced back in the 90s. So, what's the essence of it then? Why did they need to do this? Here's why. The thing is, in the United States of America, the government does not control monetary policy. Monetary policy is under the control of the Federal Reserve System. This is a private entity. Some might say, but how? The chairman of the Fed is appointed by the president. Well, first of all, they're not appointed, they're nominated and then confirmed by Congress. And secondly, here's how things actually look. So, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, is made up of 12 private reserve banks across the country, which are established on the basis of private banks. There is a Federal Reserve Board, which consists of, if I remember correctly, 9 people. I can't recall exactly right now, but that's not really important. Of those, I believe 3 are appointed as government representatives, and the rest are, through a complex rotation, the heads of these regional reserve banks. So, the majority is held by private entities, and it is they who determine the lending rate, the reserve requirement, the degree of oversight over banking activities, and so on and so forth. By the way, there's another very interesting thing here. Yeah, I've hardly ever talked about, well, neither today nor in general, about reserve requirements. That's also a very interesting point. But anyway, everything in its own time. So, here's the thing. Because the money supply is controlled by private entities, problems start to arise. For example, in the United States, there's a law that prohibits the executive branch, and really anyone at all, from auditing, say, the loans issued by the Federal Reserve by printing dollars for the central banks of other countries under the formal pretext of maintaining the stability of the global monetary system. These are absolutely colossal sums of money, and no one knows how much has been issued or under what terms. It's entirely possible that these loans are never repaid. In other words, to put it bluntly, these aren't really loans at all, especially when they're given out for, say, 99 years. By the way, this is one of the topics that sparks a lot of interest when it comes to the current relationship between Trump and the Euro-Atlantic elites, the leaders of the European Union, and also the United Kingdom, which is a NATO member. Because the United States is asking EU countries to pay for armaments, but they don't have the money. So, in other words, this money has to be printed. But since Trump doesn't need euros, it's not enough just to print them. They also have to be converted into dollars. Without loans from the Federal Reserve, this is impossible. There are a whole bunch of nuances here. I think this is one of the main reasons Trump is going after Powell, and not just because of the interest rate. The interest rate is just a kind of symbolic gesture, like, guys, you're not lowering the rate, and that's why our economic growth isn't strong enough. But again, those are just some additional things. In reality, the real fight between Trump and Powell is over control of the Federal Reserve. From a legal standpoint, there are laws, right, that say, well, that an audit isn't possible, and it's not possible to appoint most of the members of the Federal Reserve Board, and, accordingly, the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the body that actually makes decisions about the interest rate. So what do you do about that? I suspect that this PayPal team was told, guys, your task is to create an alternative monetary system to the dollar, meaning a complete replacement of the dollar, and then to take some strategic measures. Like, for example, introducing a new digital dollar that isn't controlled by the Federal Reserve. That task wasn't accomplished. Actually, at the beginning of the program, I explained why it can't be accomplished. Because if you don't explicitly state that you're issuing a national currency in which taxes can be paid, and that's the prerogative of the Federal Reserve, and repealing the Federal Reserve Act is just too complicated. The idea was to first create an alternative system and then gradually push out the Federal Reserve. But it's already clear that if you try to do this, all you will get is a drop in tax collection and a decrease in business activity, nothing else. So, in this situation, most likely, a decision was made to go ahead and start an operation to reduce the influence of the Federal Reserve in the American economy. And the law on stablecoins is not a law about increasing the efficiency of the American economy or the monetary and credit system or even the financial system as a whole. This is a law aimed at creating more or less guaranteed monetary surrogates. By the way, the circulation of the dollar in Russia in the 90s was guaranteed simply because it was directly in dollars and cash. It couldn't get any simpler. And, accordingly, a gradual reduction of the Fed's role. The negative economic consequences here are secondary. The main thing is solving political tasks. So what exactly do the United States want to do? Trump. What they want to do is this: not only the Fed, but any company that buys treasuries should be able to issue money. So what can you actually do now? You have cash, 100 million. You say, this is our working capital. We need it. We can't spend it. Trump tells you, here's the law. Buy treasuries with that 100 million. In other words, replenish the budget and then issue stablecoins backed by those treasuries, which will both, well, let's say you bought 30-year treasuries, right? So you issue stablecoins for 25 years. And they start circulating as money. As a result, the desire and need for dollars within the U.S. decreases. I don't know what exactly is written in that law regarding whether these stablecoins can be used by foreign legal entities. That's something that needs to be figured out. But, from an economic standpoint, that's not essential, it's a local matter. You issue these stablecoins, you cover your working capital with these stablecoins, and you have these treasuries sitting there, and you get a steady income from them. Well, it's not much, but it's still income. Let me give you an example. So, first, I've given this example several times, but I can tell it again. It won't hurt in this case. So, a person came to me, this was in the early 2000s, who said, I've just inherited, let's say, $100,000, and I have a business where I'm planning to invest this money. So, how should I invest it to get the maximum effect? I asked him if he had a friendly bank. He said, yes, I do. I said, then you should use that bank to buy physical gold with this money, bars, coins, it doesn't matter, and put it in the bank safe as a deposit. And have the bank open a credit line against the gold at the lowest possible interest rate. Well, because everything is guaranteed, right? You can't just take that gold out. It's sitting there. In other words, you can only take it out after you've paid off all the loans. So and by the way, he paid me before I even told him this. So he called me a year later and said, here's the situation. I got the business up and running. Everything's good. He's moved to operational profitability, meaning current revenues cover the expenses. And the credit line has only been used up to 80%. There's still room to keep going. During this time, the gold in the vault has significantly increased in value. And for that reason, theoretically, I've actually made a lot more. This is exactly what Trump is proposing. He says, look, guys, you'll have your assets stored in the vault. Well, it doesn't matter. In your electronic treasury, and you'll be using these stream coins in circulation. And the control over these stream coins will be such that users will know for sure that these treasuries or cash dollars won't go anywhere. Well, cash dollars aren't as profitable because they don't have regular coupon payments. Here's the picture. This is what Trump has actually done. As a result, the Fed ends up in a very unpleasant situation. Previously, if you wanted to make regular payments, you had to go to a bank and get a loan, and that process was already under the Fed's control. Now, if you have money, you can buy treasuries and issue these coins yourself, or you can buy them from someone else and use them for payments. And it's quite possible that the cost of these operations will be lower than with dollars. That is, especially if the interest rate on dollars is high, this will be the case. Of course, there will be problems with this. Because, I repeat once again, any shift toward monetary surrogates leads to deterioration, with only one exception, when the monetary authorities do not follow monetary policy laws. Just like what's happening in Russia right now. And the main mistake in Russia, well, all right, mistake, sabotage, even betrayal, you name it. Let's not get into the epithets right now. The problem isn't that the interest rate is high, although that's foolish, because you can't fix cost-push inflation by raising the rate. The issue is something else. The issue is that there isn't enough investment component in the money supply. That's the key problem. If this problem could be solved, then there wouldn't be any. Well, basically, that's what Mishustin tried to do in 2022 and actually did, and what Gershchenko did back in 1999 to 2002. Gershchenko had a bit more time than Mishustin, and he had more resources because he controlled the central bank, and as a result, growth rates reached 12 to 15%. I think that was truly an outstanding result. A monument should be erected to Viktor Vladimirovich Gershchenko. I think they will, sooner or later. That's it. But then, when global oil prices started to rise, the Russian liberal elites decided, why bother? We'll just live off oil. And that dragged on until the fall of 2008, and then it all crashed. Today, it lasted just a few months. And it was actually pretty funny, because since the end of 2012, we've had this sluggish decline. Of course, the statistics disguised it as slight growth, but in reality it was a decline, and everyone understood that. And then suddenly, at the end of 2022, when the Mishustin started a new policy, there was a revival. I remember it well because I was the first person to write that maybe we would see growth. I even remember, I think I said it live on some broadcast. Yeah. And indeed, by the beginning of 2023, the statistics, then Putin mentioned this as a possibility in his address, I think, in 2023. That was around the end of January or the beginning of February, and after that, the statistics started to show economic growth. And when it started to show economic growth, some groups got agitated and said, how can this be? Russia is at war, Russia is supposed to collapse. But instead, economic growth began, so we have to fight this urgently. And then that famous three-step maneuver was carried out. First, they devalued the ruble. Then, as a result of rising prices, they raised the interest rate, and naturally, the economy fell and continues to fall. By the way, right now I think there is a very high probability that this operation will be carried out again. The decrease in prices is relative, meaning the slowdown in price growth is connected to the devaluation of the ruble. And this is also well known. When national currencies are devalued, import prices rise immediately. But when they are revalued, price decreases happen very slowly. And now it's had a very, very slow effect. So now, as I suspect, our monetary authorities are going to take action. First, they will announce that there's been a victory, that their policy has finally led to lower prices, that their policy of high interest rates has finally resulted in lower prices. Although, I'll say it again, this has nothing to do with the interest rate. Because of the rate, prices have only gone up. And, well, the slight decrease in inflation happened because of the ruble's revaluation. Then they'll say, but unfortunately, the budget situation is bad, so the ruble needs to be devalued. And there's already talk about this. The ruble will be devalued. Inflation, of course, will immediately spike sharply, and then they'll say, unfortunately, we lowered the rate too soon. As a result, inflation has returned, so now we need to raise the rate even higher, to 25 or 28. So, I think this is the plan that the central bank has today. And maybe I'm wrong, I can't insist on it, but based on my 30 years of experience dealing with these people, I want to say that, well, except for the younger generation, all these people who are currently really leading our monetary authorities, I remember all of them from the situation in the 90s, you know? I've participated in various discussions and meetings with them, so I understand very well what they're like, what they understand, and what they don't. So, with that, we don't have much time left, and it's time to start wrapping things up a bit. First, the decisions that Trump made are just a palliative, that is, half measures compared to the task that he and those behind him set for him at the end of 2024 when they brought him to power. The task was to create an alternative to the Federal Reserve, a digital central bank. This task was not accomplished, and it couldn't have been accomplished because it's impossible without shutting down or repealing the law on the Federal Reserve, which is exactly what makes the papers printed by the Fed be called the national currency of the United States of America. Second, since the task of taking control over the Federal Reserve, including by weakening it, hasn't gone anywhere, it was decided to allow the issuance of pure monetary surrogates, stablecoins. And laws were passed that remove administrative control from their circulation, meaning transaction costs. In other words, the circulation of these very stable coins becomes almost as simple as the circulation of the dollar. This is also a very important thing. And finally, third, as a result, the dependence of the American economy on dollar issuance, specifically the internal American economy, will decrease. But as a consequence, the negative effects of this very activity will manifest. How will this happen? We'll see. There are different scenarios here. Well, for example, everyone who buys treasuries will start issuing their own stable coins. There will be too many of them, they won't be able to sell them, and as a result, it will turn out that the costs of maintaining them become greater than the income from their circulation. and then a lot of people will start abandoning them. That's one scenario. Another scenario is that they will use stablecoins to evade paying taxes, and so on and so forth. A lot also depends, for example, on the actions of the American tax authorities, how they will calculate tax collection from those transactions that are paid for with these very stable coins, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, there are these 4 points which, in terms of their impact on the outside world, will be absolutely zero. Because theoretically, every country has its own national currency, and any dollar surrogate is just that, a surrogate for the dollar. So this is only relevant for those who conduct business activities within the United States of America. The results are still unknown because there will be a whole bunch of different factors coming into play, many of which are still unknown today. Surely, some additional measures will have to be taken. And finally, it's important to understand that this scheme is absolutely not applicable in any other country where, the central bank is, well, part of the system of state economic management. But in our country, that's not the case. Here, our central bank represents external interests. Whereas, in more or less normal countries, it's an internal instrument. That's why this experience of the United States of America, well, in other countries with a normal monetary system, it's not just inapplicable, it's simply unnecessary. It's pointless. So, I kind of think that there's really only any point in discussing this topic for, well, maybe only political scientists who look at it as an element of the struggle between different elites within the United States of America. No, of course, someone will be able to gain something from this, someone will, and someone will lose because of it. But I'll say it again, overall the picture is clear. The general outcome for the United States of America and its economy will be negative. But as for which of the political elites will benefit from this and which will lose out, that's something we'll have to watch and see. And finally, I want to say that this whole story, of course, was only possible if you understand that the old model, the one controlled by the U.S. Federal Reserve System, is dying. Because if everything were fine, well, how many years has it been, right? The Federal Reserve has existed for over 100 years now. Let me remind you, it was created at the end of 1913 and began operating on January 2nd, 1914 and 1900. So now, basically, it's been, 111 years. And accordingly, as long as everything was fine, nobody interfered there. To be more precise, those who did interfere got their hands slapped pretty hard. But now, the collapse of the economic model, of which the Fed's printing machine was a part, that we're witnessing right before our eyes, has led to the need to somehow change this situation. And that's why I keep telling everyone the same thing. Dear friends, if you truly want your business to genuinely thrive and prosper, then thoughtfully consider what you'll strategically do after the immediate crisis, how you truly want to see your business evolve, and how you personally want to see yourself. This topic is, well, actively discussed, including on my Telegram channel, which is called Khazin. And, in general, I think the results of Trump's crypto laws will only confirm this situation. Well, on that note, our time has come to an end. You've been listening to Economics in Russian. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.